Hello again, Perspectives in Child Maltreatment. In Module 7, we are talking about child sexual abuse. I began my professional career about 20 years ago, right out of grad school, as a forensic interviewer and therapist for a child advocacy center here in Southwest Mississippi. And this has been a very long career, even after leaving the Child Advocacy Center and coming to Colin to teach. I have not seemed to get away from the fact that children are mistreated. If I'm talking about child abuse, or if I'm talking about human trafficking or drug use or adverse childhood experiences, I always have students that have been through these terrible things. It's a sad reality that this is something that we need to address, and it's not something that's new. Lloyd DeMause in 1974 wrote a very seminal book, and in that book he talks about the tragedy of childhood, just the difficulty that kids have gone through across time, across the world, throughout history. He cites examples of prostitution, child prostitution, brothels, and when laws are passed, they may not be enforced. There is an entire industry referred to as sex tourism, whereby people will travel to parts of the world where police officers are bribed for the purposes of these terrible crimes against children. And we always need to define terms at the onset of any discussion. So how would we define child sexual abuse? Surprisingly, this can be debated because different states emphasize different facets, whatever seems to be of import in their state. And therefore, prosecution may change, crimes may change. So let's define child sexual abuse as any involvement of a child in sexual activity. This is debated in terms of adolescence. Where do we stop defining someone as a child? Can a 16-year-old consent to sexual activity? And if so, to whom can they consent? Now, in Mississippi, a 16-year-old can consent to sexual activity with anyone within a 36-month window above them. So this is still debated because sometimes it can be uncertain as to whether or not consent was actually given. There may be coercion, there may be threats of force, and an adolescent may be seemingly compliant, but the state argues that in our statute, Mississippi, that someone who is under the age of 16 and someone who is 16 in a relationship with someone above 36 months is no match for a predator who is grooming this young adolescent. So to operationally define something is to find out what does the author of this research study mean. And so if we're going to operationally define child sexual abuse, if we are to operationalize child sexual abuse, we need to look almost as an article by article or case by case basis. And the same thing in terms of a legal definition. So all states will include child sexual abuse in their maltreatment statutes, but some will argue specific terms or specific actions. So we need to look at some examples. Child exploitation is the use of a child under the age of 18 for the purpose of prostitution or pornography. and various state statutes will include abuse and exploitation. So in Delaware, abuse includes sexual abuse and exploitation. In Arkansas, sexual intercourse is deviant sexual activity or sexual contact by forcible compulsion. Indecent exposure, forcing the watching of pornography or live sexual activity. Abuse also includes sexual abuse and exploitation. So there would be some difference made between a parent who is neglecting their child and the child stumbles upon their pornographic material, and this sort of forcing a child to watch something that is inappropriate. Both are wrong, but both would fall under different legal definitions, which is the reason why we need to clarify in the law. So child exploitation versus sexting. There are laws targeting child pornography that are also being applied to teenagers who are sending sexually explicit pictures. So this is something that we have to discuss. Teens from the age of 14 to 17 send about 3,000 messages per month. Most adolescents on average are sending 100 text messages per day. That's just including texts, posts, snaps. Females send more of these messages from males. Now that's just the baseline of how often teenagers are using their phones. But what happens when these messages become sexualized? Teens are engaging in sexting and cross boundaries. One study, estimated 39% of teens 14 to 17 admitted to sexting. It doesn't speak to those that did not admit. Another study, 71% of girls and 67% of boys had sent explicit messages. So how is this linked into our discussion of child exploitation? If teenagers are sending messages willingly, is this exploitation? It gets confusing. The findings are debated because sexually explicit pictures that include minors are illegal. So if a 14-year-old is sending a picture of herself or himself, that is by definition that's child pornography, even if it is done willingly, because we would argue that a child who's 14 can get caught up in peer pressure, may be not fully developed emotionally and psychologically to make the best decisions. 34 to 44% of teenagers acknowledge that images could be forwarded without consent. But what those findings also imply is that between 60 to 70% of kids are not fully aware of the fact that if they send a picture of them, that someone could forward that. That is implicit in adolescence, is not thinking things through, because the prefrontal cortex is not fully formed and won't be formed till the age of 25. This is the part of the brain that makes logical decisions. The part of the brain that is driven by excitement and emotion, that part is developed by the age of 12 or 13. So kids are really driven by some of these impulses. I say in my classes that the gas pedal works at 12 or 13, but the brake's not fully formed till the age of 25. So what is child sexual abuse across the state? Across the nation, teens are being charged with crimes. Teenagers are sending explicit pictures of themselves, and they are literally trafficking child pornography. They are getting jail time. They're getting fines. One example is Philip Alpert was 17 and he was dating a girl who was 16. After the breakup, he sent a mass email in what is known as revenge pornography. So he was upset about the breakup, so he sent sexually explicit images that she had sent to him. He was convicted of transmitting child pornography. He registered as a child sex offender and will remain on that registry until he's 43. So revenge pornography, the forwarding of sexually explicit images in anger, has received national notoriety with adult celebrities, but it happens tons with teenagers. And it is falling under state statutes as child exploitation. So Jorge Canal, an 18-year-old, sent explicit photos to a 14-year-old girlfriend. The girlfriend's parents found these pictures, called the police. Jorge was convicted for distributing obscene material to a minor. This was upheld by the Iowa Supreme Court. He was fined $250 and received a year probation, but he registered as a sex offender. So that means that he can't live within a close proximity to a playground. He can't be around children, and he will be identified as a threat to children. Now, some people see this as unfair. Other people see this as just. This is a conversation that always sparks a great deal of debate. Florida, Nebraska, Texas, and Utah, and Vermont have recently adapted their laws. Vermont has specified it is now legal for 13 to 18-year-olds to exchange nude pictures. And although it is now legal, does not necessarily mean that it is beneficial or helpful. It is still a crime to forward such pictures. In Florida, the first offense is non-criminal. So the first offense of trafficking explicit photos is not criminal. $60 fine and 8 hours of community service for additional charges. Child sexual abuse, as we've said, it's not new, but psychological literature of this was quite minimal. It was limited to case studies, and case studies don't provide the rigor of a control group. Empirical research is important because a control group minimizes extraneous variables. And so these standardized methods of assessment are important to make sure that we are finding out the best information. So when we think about research, especially research from 1970 forward, we will see an intense effort to find the best research methodology possible, and this is challenging for reasons we will explain. When we see why research methodology is important, sometimes we need to realize that abuse does not happen in a public place. And so usually there are biases in the research. What that means is our research is limited to confirmed cases of abuse. We can't study research. We can't study and research child sexual abuse that we don't know about. And once we know about it, it's hard to really say whether or not the cases that are identified and researched are the same. So we don't know what we don't know. Abuse happens in secrecy. Less than 50% of children disclose abuse. Now look at this important article from Lawson and Chafin in 1992. 43% of children with a sexually transmitted infection denied sexual contact. Now that there is quite gripping. So you have children with proof that sexual abuse has happened. Okay, they have contracted a sexually transmitted infection. It's proven. And in 43% of kids with STDs, they're denying that they've had any kind of sexual contact. So that should tell us right off the bat that there is secrecy, there's shame involved, and this is very difficult to identify, let alone research. There is threatened harm. Denial is quite common. Children may lack verbal ability to disclose. So that's a problem. Children can just have a lack of verbal ability to really communicate. They may not fully know what's happening. In the NICS-4, sexual abuse is identified in a few different categories. Acts of intrusion. In Mississippi, this is called sexual battery. Acts of molestation, or in Mississippi, it's touching and handling for lustful purposes. And then exposing children to sexually explicit material, or parental failure to monitor child and adolescent activity. There's also in the NICS-4 a distinction between a threatened or attempted abuse. A Gallup poll in 1995 showed higher estimates than the NICS-4. So now this is a poll, this is not a national study. So a poll is different. A poll is sort of something of a national survey, but it's not, does not quite have the same level of scientific rigor in terms of sampling methods. The Gallup poll interviewed parents from a representative sample, and this poll found that the estimates to be considerably higher than the NCIS. Children were especially vulnerable, 5 to 8 years old, and then 13 to 17-year-old. Well, we can find that these categories or these age groups are where the numbers are trending. So kids seem to be targeted from 5 to 8. They're abused at a high rate. And then there's a almost different class or category of child sexual abuse from 13 to 17. Finkler, Turner, Ormrod, and Hamby in 2010 found that higher levels of reported sexual victimization than did the NICS-4. Children in 2003, there were estimated 2,000 children, and 4,000 in 2008. Children were interviewed between the ages of 2 and 17. And so in this research article, children themselves were interviewed. And this gave significantly high results. So it's an estimate of anywhere between 2 and 3% of this sample. Finkler, Turner, Ormrod, and Hamby again in 2010, they used a broader definition for sexual abuse. So this could have elevated numbers. Peer assault is also included in their findings. So a 13-year-old acts out against another 13-year-old. Also statutory rape. The rates of sexual abuse vary on how abuse is defined, and this is why operational definitions are so important. When you're looking at stats, you can't just throw numbers out. You need to clarify how the numbers were originated. What was the original intent of the research? We look at perpetrators. Only a minority are strangers. The vast majority are friends, family, acquaintances. 10% are close family. Close family perpetrators, such as stepfathers, are 10% more likely to offend than a natural parent. So when you see stepfathers abusing at 10 times higher likelihood than a natural parent. This is telling. Acquaintances are most often the perpetrator. 47.8% perpetrators are known to the victim, but not close relatives. When you look at child sexual abuse perpetrators, the vast majority are males, 90%. However, female perpetrators are receiving a lot more media attention. So I have some links here. There are notorious teacher scandals of child abuse that have been the subject of everything from Dateline to movies. Now there are movies that are streaming out on your streaming services that seem to almost sensationalize the child sexual abuse of male adolescents by female teachers. We discuss this as almost kind of a reverse sexual double standard. If there is a male teacher who abuses a 14-year-old female, he is seen as a danger and a threat to society. If there is a 35 or 40-year-old teacher and she abuses a 14-year-old male, she's not viewed as a threat. She doesn't receive the same jail time in some cases. However, David Finkeler has said in recent years that this is changing, in that now you have more female judges who are not going to just dismiss this as education. In the years past, especially in the 80s, a lot of these cases were not seen as abuse. But overall, the vast majority of offenders are males. They rarely gain control through violence. Most use grooming behaviors to gain access to children. This could be through dating a mother. This could be through a coaching environment or teaching environment. Grooming the environment is a phrase that is used to describe the intense network of relationships that is necessary for perpetrators to get access to children. However, we're seeing in recent years that it's unnecessary to groom the environment if there is electronic grooming. Many teenagers and many students in my classes over the years are familiar with the phenomenon of catfishing, going online, creating a false profile, essentially lying about your identity. Well, this has been a tactic of perpetrators for decades, but it's become recently dangerous because children are going online earlier. There is a Discord app. A lot of young kids are gaming, whether it's Discord or whether it's Snapchat or Instagram. Nothing stops a perpetrator from creating a false profile. And there are now apps that are being marketed to try to help parents prevent the victimization of their children. Grooming takes place with female victims and male victims, but predators may treat young females as equal. So a predator may try to kind of make a younger female feel more adult. The predators may act like a younger male. So this is called regression. They may act in a more immature way. Sexual behavior usually begins quite gradually. Sexual abuse victims are more likely to be female. Only 20% of child sexual abuse reported to CPS involves males, but also males may be less likely to report. This has been a very well-documented phenomenon that males are less likely to report abuse. Rates are 3.4 times as frequent when abuse is defined as intercourse. So abuse is more likely to be reported when it is serious, quote unquote serious, when it involves more invasive sexual activity. The peak age of vulnerability to child sexual abuse is between the age of 7 to 13, when the kids are most vulnerable. The age of onset is later for boys than girls. Child sexual abuse is no respecter of socioeconomic status. It is reported more for low-income families, but not by much. If parents are emotionally unavailable, this makes child abuse more likely. They may seek attention elsewhere, or they may just not have the emotional support network. They may have some vulnerabilities. They may have some areas of the walls to the castle, right? The walls are broken down, and child sexual abuse is greater among children raised by single parents. For obvious reasons, they're working more. Financially, there are needs, and offenders target this. There is a long history of child sexual abuse through the churches. The Southern Baptist denomination that I grew up in is from the Free Church tradition, which means it is not connected to a larger body of oversight, whereas Presbyterian churches are members of a presbytery. The Methodist Church is part of a network. Ministers are appointed by bishops in some denominations, whereas Southern Baptist, there's committees and groups within the church that appoint their own, that hire their own. And so what has happened in this denomination is that predators have been quietly dismissed from churches. You know, churches perhaps see themselves as being well-meaning. They don't want to ruin this guy's career, so they fire this person, and oftentimes this has become it's happened because there's a minimization, there is an ignorance about what child abuse really is and how bad it is. So it created a system for 20 to 30 years where offenders were simply passed along from church to church. Sexual predators have been guilty of quote unquote sexual indiscretions, right? This has been minimized to seen as simply a mistake or a falling from grace. And so it leads to the question, how many second chances do we give? I heard that on a talk radio show that was religious in context, and I actually called in because it was a kind of a terrible argument in the sense that the radio show host lumped in if a guy messes up sexually and has an affair, he'd linked that in the same discussion as if a person abuses a child, right? These are two different arguments. And even 20 years ago when I was working in child advocacy, it made me bristle then, it makes me bristle now. It just goes to show you how we need to make a lot of progress in our communities of faith of really understanding what child abuse is. In terms of religious settings and churches, the Catholic Church garnered a lot of attention, from 4 to 4.3% of all priests abused children. This was an article produced by John Jay College. This is an estimate, but Southern Baptists were in the news recently as well. Here's a link to NBC News as well that references what we just spoke of. We would say that extrafamilial child sexual abuse in the 80s through a couple of really high-profile daycare cases have almost, I would say, created subfields of child sexual abuse. So my career field of forensic interviewing was found to be necessary. It was really created because of a lot of botched interviews that came to light in the 80s, some of these daycare cases. So one example was the McMartin preschool case in 1983. This was a 7-year case with 2 gridlocked juries, cost millions of dollars, no arrests. And the research found that a lot of the interview techniques were highly leading. They were suggestive in the sense of asking very leading or misleading questions, and it led to reforms in the criminal investigation process and led to a field of forensic interviewing. Norman Watson was a Little League coach, pled guilty to 39 counts of sexual abuse. He was sentenced to 84 years. But even after he was placed on the sexual offenders registry, he was still allowed to coach, still had opportunities to coach. It shows great ignorance in the community. Teachers have abused children, as I've referenced earlier. If a teacher is not stopped during the testing phase, then this can proceed to grooming. And testing seems to be phase 1 for offenders. Exploitation would include pornography, child prostitution, sex trafficking of children. In a meta-analysis, which is essentially when we take lots of articles and lots of research, and we do research on the research, right? So we find some unifying methodology to take these stats and plug them into computers. So in a meta-analysis showed that child sexual abuse victims are more likely to suffer from anxiety disorders, dissociation, hysterical symptoms or hysteria, depression, low self-esteem, and sexual disturbances. Also, borderline personality disorder, sexual dysfunction, and re-victimization or sexual offending. What are some other consequences? Much of the research is on adult child sexual abuse. Unfortunately, this relies too heavily on victim self-report. So we are interviewing, let's say hypothetically, adult women who are in inpatient psychiatric facilities who recount the sexual abuse of their childhood. This gives us very valuable information. We're certainly appreciative of adult survivors who are participating in this research. However, there can be an inability to validate the reports, right? Because we don't have the ability in this research to go back and validate, prove, not to invalidate the experience of the survivor, but it would make the research methodology tighter, more airtight. Many of the victim report studies are clinical in the settings. This is problematic, and it represents a more negative symptomology. So for instance, there's an underrepresentation of adult survivors of child sexual abuse who are recovering well, right? Because these folks don't go into the clinical settings, and some could argue that these are convenient samples, that it's a little bit more convenient to find those in clinical settings. It's much harder to find those who are surviving well, who are I would say more normative in their recovery. Those who may have difficulty struggling, overcoming this abuse, find themselves in clinical settings where they're more likely to be studied. So Finkler and Brown published a seminal article in 1985, and this is an article that I came across in grad school, and it has formed a lot of my practice and formed uh, a lot of discussion that I've had with my students over the years. And let me explain. They outlined a theory that they call the traumagenic dynamics model. And so they discussed betrayal, stigmatization, and powerlessness, traumatic sexualization. And so what the article hoped to do is to create a model by which we look at not for the purposes of comparing trauma, but it gives clinicians some understanding of what someone may be going through. Okay, so let me explain. The first of the traumagenic dynamic model, betrayal. Child discovers they were harmed, betrayed. They experience disappointment, loss of trust, depression, anger, and mistrust. They may not realize they've been betrayed until at some point along their process of surviving, of overcoming this abuse. Second would be stigmatization. Negative connotations are communicated to the child, a sense of badness, shame, guilt. Stigmatization leads to low self-esteem, self-injurious behavior, such as cutting, suicidal ideation, and negative life outcomes, such as drug abuse and prostitution. The third would be powerlessness. The child's attempts to avoid abuse fail. They try to get out of the abuse and they are not able to. There is a repeated invasion of the child's body against their will. It reinforces the child's perception as a victim, and it may produce fear and anxiety. That also may produce a need to control kind of compensatory responses such as sexual acting out. Fourth, traumatic sexualization. The abuse shapes the victim's sexual feelings. The sexual behavior becomes dysfunctional. Sexual behavior is developmentally inappropriate. Promiscuity, hypersexuality, or an aversion to sex. So perhaps this is the part that was compelling for me 20 plus years ago and still is. When betrayal is significant, meaning when the child experiences a great sense of betrayal, and Finkler and Brown differentiate. For instance, if it's a first degree relative, dad or stepdad, as opposed to a little league coach, the betrayal is sometimes experienced to be more significant. Now, as a therapist, this was important to me, not so that I could compare person A's trauma to person B. No, this helps us understand the dynamics, the traumagenic dynamics. So it helps us with empathy. It helps us in dealing with children in our context, whether that is we're a social worker or a therapist or law enforcement. It helps us to kind of see if the abuser was a dad, biological father, as opposed to a person they didn't have a relationship with. Okay, the sense of betrayal could be greater, and we need to be mindful of that. When stigmatization is significant. So when the victim identifies as damaged goods, when this really seems to connect with the victim survivor's identity. Thirdly, when powerlessness is significant, Finkler and Brown note that when the mother fails to believe the victim's initial disclosure, this is tremendously harmful. So when we compare this, right, first degree relative versus non-relative, victim identifies as damaged goods as opposed to that's not really an issue for them. Mother fails to believe the victim as opposed to mother is extremely supportive, mother gets rid of the boyfriend, You can see how this is shaping up. And then fourth, when traumatic sexualization is significant. So if the abuse is invasive physically, so if it's sexual battery as opposed to uh, touching for lustful purposes. Now, I want to be careful. We don't ever want to minimize, right? So if you're working with a young child, and I don't believe Finkler and Brown meant it this way at all. We don't want to minimize any kind of experience, but working with a child who was abused one time by a just an acquaintance of the family. The mother was extremely supportive and protected the child. The abuse was not as invasive. That person may not have the same long-term trauma as someone who was abused by first-degree relative. Now, as helpers of children, we need to be very careful that we don't minimize someone's trauma. This is simply to help us in terms of empathy, and also to realize we probably need greater levels of care long term, probably more therapy. For some, getting family therapy and counseling may be enough. Others might need inpatient hospitalization for a time. Some may need additional services and support, and may need that support for a longer duration. So I would encourage you to find Finkler and Brown article, and also the other articles that cite Finkler and Brown. So you can do research and find out, okay, who is doing this next line of research along the lines of traumagenic effects of abuse. So I look forward to hearing some of our discussion on this online. Look forward to seeing how this is impacting you, and it can be very difficult to talk about, but I certainly thank you for staying in the class this long, and for trying to make an impact for children in years to come. Okay, take care.